girl murdered by her brother returns with a chilling truth about heaven. The room was silent, save for the slow ticking of the clock that seemed to stretch the seconds into eternity. Emma sat frozen on the couch, her back pressed against the worn fabric, her small body trembling from the weight of the unseen force that had taken hold of her. The night air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows seemed to crawl over the walls like creeping fingers, pulling her deeper into the growing nightmare. The television was muted, the flickering light casting an eerie glow over the room, but Emma wasn't looking at it. She wasn't looking at anything in particular. Her eyes were wide, staring straight ahead, her pupils dilated with fear. The bloodstains on her clothes had dried into a sickening crust, the memories of the violence still fresh in her mind. The dull pain in her chest was the least of her worries. Her brother, Jeremy, had been the one to do it. The one who had ended her life with a single blow, his face twisted with rage and something darker that Emma hadn't understood until it was too late. Now she was here, stuck in this strange in-between place, and everything was wrong. She didn't know where she was, didn't know how she had gotten here, but the weight of the darkness pressed on her chest, and her breath came in shallow gasps as the truth began to sink in. Where am I? The words escaped her lips in a hoarse whisper, the question directed at no one. She wanted to scream, to beg for an answer, but the emptiness around her only deepened. She heard something then, a soft sound, almost imperceptible, like a breath being drawn from just beyond the shadows. It was a familiar sound, one she hadn't heard in years, and yet it chilled her to the bone. Emma. Her name. The voice was unmistakable, a low whisper in the stillness. It was her brother's voice, Jeremy's voice. But it wasn't like it had been when he was alive. This was something different. It was hollow, strained, filled with an unnatural coldness that made her skin crawl. Her head snapped toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Only the emptiness. Jeremy? She called out, her voice trembling. It felt wrong even saying his name. How could she speak to him after everything he had done? After everything that had happened? There was no answer, only the thick silence that enveloped her, suffocating her in its grip. She felt the weight of his presence without ever seeing him, and the sensation was enough to send a wave of nausea through her. She didn't want to acknowledge him, didn't want to face the monster he had become. But the silence pressed on, and something inside her urged her to call out again. Jeremy, please, what happened? The words came out in a rush, desperate and raw. She had to know. She had to understand. The silence stretched out again, but this time it was broken by a low, guttural chuckle. Emma froze, her blood running cold at the sound. It was his laugh, but it wasn't the same laugh she remembered. It was dark, twisted, like a sick parody of the boy she once knew. You always did have a way with words, didn't you, Emma? Jeremy's voice echoed in the room, a cruel mockery of the past. But you'll never understand what happened. You'll never know the truth. Emma's heart began to race, and the pain in her chest flared as though something was twisting inside her. The words sent a shiver down her spine, a chill that settled deep into her bones. What do you mean? She whispered, her voice barely audible. She felt like she was suffocating, like the walls around her were closing in. What happened? Why did you kill me? Jeremy's laugh echoed again, louder this time, more unsettling. You don't get it, do you? He sneered. I didn't kill you, Emma. I freed you. The words hit her like a physical blow, and she recoiled as if they had burned her. Freed her? Her mind couldn't process what he was saying. The truth, the reality of it all, felt like it was slipping through her fingers, like sand running through a sieve. Freed me, she repeated, her voice breaking. From what? She could feel his presence again, closer now, almost suffocating. The darkness seemed to close in, and the air grew thicker, more oppressive, as though the room itself was alive with malice. She could hear the soft scraping of something against the floor, the shuffle of footsteps that seemed to echo in her head. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained to see, to make sense of it, but there was nothing there, nothing except the darkness. The silence stretched again, but this time it was broken by a whisper, soft but unmistakable. You'll understand soon enough. The silence was so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on Emma's chest. Her body was frozen, caught in the unyielding grip of the darkness around her. The air was too still, too silent. And yet, despite the oppressive quiet, the faintest sound still managed to slip through, the soft creak of floorboards behind her, a barely audible breath brushing against her ear. Her head snapped toward it, but there was nothing. Nothing except the shadows. She was no longer sure if she was awake or lost in some horrifying nightmare. Everything felt too real, too tangible, but she couldn't make sense of anything. She had died. She had felt the life drain out of her, the weight of her brother's violent hand closing around her throat. The moment her breath had stopped, her world had gone black. And now, here she was, trapped in this strange, otherworldly space, suspended between the life she had known and whatever it was that waited for her next. Her heart ached, not with the physical pain she had felt in the last moments of her life, but with something deeper, something that gnawed at her from the inside out. The grief wasn't just hers. It was the weight of a love unfulfilled, of a life cut short. It was the face of her brother, the face of the person she had trusted the most, the person who had murdered her, standing in her memories like a ghost. A shadow that she couldn't outrun, even in death. Emma? The whisper came again, soft as a breeze, but sharp enough to slice through her thoughts. She recognized the voice instantly. Jeremy. But it wasn't the voice she remembered from their childhood, filled with laughter, teasing, and warmth. It was cold, hollow. It echoed in the emptiness around her like a broken record. She felt his presence before she saw him, the heavy weight of his energy crawling along the edges of the space, pressing in on her from all sides. "What do you want?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them, shaking with both fear and confusion. The walls of the room seemed to shift with every beat of her heart, contorting in a way that made her feel like she was losing her mind. "You're not supposed to be here, Emma." His voice floated toward her, thick with venom, and yet something else, something almost like a distant plea. "I'm sorry, I didn't want this." The apology felt so out of place, so wrong, that Emma couldn't process it. He had killed her. How could there be any apology that would make this okay? There was no reconciliation here. There was only the hollow pit in her stomach that had started the moment her breath had stopped. "You murdered me!" The words broke from her chest, her voice shaking with the sheer weight of her anger. How could you be sorry for that?" The shadows around her seemed to writhe at her words, twisting and distorting as if the very darkness around her was alive, trying to swallow her whole. For a moment, Emma felt a tremor in the air, a chill that swept through her as if the world itself was beginning to buckle beneath the weight of her fury. But there was no release. There was no outlet for her pain. And then, in the distance, she saw him. Jeremy. But it wasn't the Jeremy she remembered. The one standing in front of her now was a twisted version of the boy she had once known. His eyes were wide, unblinking, glassy, vacant, and empty. His skin had a pallor to it that made his face look as though it had been drained of life. His mouth twitched into something that resembled a grin, but it wasn't a smile. It was a grotesque, mocking imitation of one. "You can't understand, Emma." His voice was distant, detached from any sense of reality, as though the person speaking wasn't the brother she had known, but something else entirely. "I didn't kill you. You were already dead." Emma's heart stopped. The words didn't make sense. She was already dead? How could that be true? She could feel herself here. She could feel her body, her emotions. She could feel the crushing weight of her heart, the memories that tied her to her life. She was still her, the same Emma who had lived and breathed just hours ago. "What are you talking about?" she gasped, her voice shaking with disbelief. "You killed me, Jeremy." "I did kill you," he interrupted, his voice suddenly turning sharp, full of that same malice that had taken over him the night of her death. "But you were never alive, Emma. You've always been dead, since the moment you started pretending." His words hit her like a slap to the face, each one more horrifying than the last. She wanted to recoil, to run, but the room kept spinning, warping around her. She couldn't escape the grip of his words, couldn't escape the suffocating truth that they carried. "You've always known, haven't you?" His voice was like a snake, smooth and insidious, slithering into her mind. "You just didn't want to admit it. You lived in a fantasy, pretending everything was fine. You didn't even see me, the real me, until it was too late. The room seemed to collapse in on her, the air around her thick with the stench of despair. He was right. It was the thing she had refused to acknowledge for so long. The growing darkness within Jeremy, the small cracks in their relationship, the violence he had always hidden behind his smile. She had seen the signs but had ignored them. She had turned away, pretending that everything would work out, that they were fine, that they were family. "No," Emma whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of the revelation. I didn't see it. I couldn't." The shadows around her deepened, swirling faster, their blackness becoming more palpable, more alive. She couldn't breathe. The air felt thick and choking, suffocating her with every inhalation. She felt like she was drowning, sinking into a darkness that didn't just surround her, but was a part of her. And that was when it came, the truth, as horrifying as it was, crashing down like a weight on her chest, sealing her in this unending nightmare. "You were always meant to see the truth, Emma." Jeremy's voice was faint, distant, but so clear in her mind. "But now, you'll understand what I didn't. We are both here. But not for long." The darkness surged around her. Emma's breath came in short, ragged gasps, her chest rising and falling in a desperate rhythm that she couldn't control. The darkness around her pulsed, every inch of it vibrating with a malevolent energy, as if it was alive, aware of her every thought, every heartbeat. The shadows seemed to tighten, closing in on her like the walls of a cage. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the weight of her brother's presence pressing against her from every direction. "You never understood, did you, Emma?" Jeremy's voice was like a whisper against the back of her neck, sending a wave of icy dread over her skin. She spun around, trying to find him, but the shadows only shifted, and the room around her morphed into something unfamiliar, twisted and warped, as though the very air was shifting beneath her feet. The walls, once steady and unyielding, now slithered with an unnatural movement, as if they were made of flesh, breathing with a life of their own. The air grew heavier with each passing moment, the oppressive weight of it pressing against her chest, suffocating her, until she thought she might collapse from the sheer terror. But she couldn't collapse. Not yet. Not until she understood. "What do you want from me, Jeremy?" Her voice cracked with the strain of trying to hold it together, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. Her mind was spinning. She had to know the truth. She had to know what had happened to her, why she was here, and most importantly, why her brother, her own flesh and blood, had done this to her. "I want you to see it, Emma." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, swirling in the chaos that surrounded her. "I want you to see the truth." The darkness seemed to part, and she was once again alone, standing in a hollow space that felt like it was beyond the confines of the world she had known. There was no floor beneath her feet, no walls to guide her, only an endless void stretching out before her. But even in the emptiness, she could feel the presence of Jeremy lurking just beyond the edge of her awareness. His words hung in the air, thick with meaning, with the weight of something ancient and impossible. "I'm sorry." His voice echoed, distorted, almost mocking. "I'm sorry you had to see this, Emma. But you were never going to wake up from the dream. You were never going to understand." Emma's stomach churned with the weight of his words. Never wake up from the dream? Understand? What was he saying? She had died, yes. She had felt the poison spread through her veins, had felt her body grow cold, her heart slow, until it stopped altogether. But now she was here, in this twisted version of reality, and nothing made sense. How could any of this be real? Her head spun with confusion and terror, and she reached out for something, anything, that could ground her in this nightmare. But there was nothing. The space around her was too fluid, too distorted, to offer any sense of stability. She was drifting, untethered, and the weight of the unknown pressed harder against her chest. The shadows shifted again, and this time, something different emerged from the darkness. A figure, barely visible at first, took form in front of her. It was a man, tall, with an expression that was both familiar and distant. A figure she recognized from the deepest corners of her memory. It was her father. His face was the same as she remembered, but there was something wrong about him. something cold in his eyes, something devoid of warmth or love. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stood in front of her, watching her with an expression that she couldn't read. His presence filled the space, casting a long shadow over everything around them. "Dad?" The word slipped from her mouth, barely a whisper, but the moment she spoke it, she wished she hadn't. The silence that followed felt like an eternity, stretching out between them like a chasm. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, his cold gaze never leaving her. She felt a chill run down her spine as he finally spoke, his voice a low murmur that sent a ripple of dread through her. "You didn't see it, Emma? What do you mean?" Her voice shook with the growing sense of panic. "What did I miss? What did I not see?" Her father's eyes darkened, and the space around her seemed to fold inward, the shadows tightening like a noose around her neck. "You've always been blind to it, Emma." His voice cracked with sorrow, a deep, unsettling sorrow that sent a shudder through her soul. "You were never supposed to see the truth. You were never meant to know." Emma's head spun, her thoughts racing as the pieces of her life, her family, her brother, seemed to collapse inward, crashing into a reality that she couldn't grasp. She had been blind. She had been complicit in something she didn't even know was happening. But what? Her heart pounded in her chest, her pulse quickening as she tried to find her footing, tried to understand. But it felt like the more she tried to reach for the truth, the further it slipped from her grasp. "Dad, please," her voice cracked with the weight of desperation. "Tell me the truth. Tell me what happened." His face softened, but his eyes still burned with an unsettling truth that Emma wasn't ready to face. "You've seen it, Emma, but you've been too afraid to see it all." Suddenly, the world around her shuddered. The air thickened, the space around her warping as a new sensation washed over her, cold, jagged, like 1,000 knives scraping against her soul. She realized with a horrifying clarity that this wasn't just about her death. It was about something much darker, something that had always been there, lurking just out of sight. "No, no," Emma gasped, her hands clutching at her chest. "What are you saying?" The shadows closed in on her, pulling tighter with each breath, the truth about to be revealed. And in that moment, everything went dark. The silence pressed against Emma like a physical weight, wrapping around her with an oppressive heaviness. It was as though the very air had thickened, becoming almost suffocating, and she couldn't escape it. The darkness that surrounded her was not just a void, it was a living, breathing entity, coiling around her every thought, every movement. Every instinct screamed for her to wake up, to run, but there was nowhere to go. No way to escape. She opened her eyes, though she wasn't sure she'd closed them to begin with. The world around her had shifted again, twisted and contorted, folding into itself like a shattered dream. She wasn't in the empty, shadow-filled void anymore, but instead, she found herself standing in the hallway of her childhood home, the place she'd grown up. The walls were familiar, cracked paint, old wooden paneling, but something was off. The house was wrong. The light that poured through the windows wasn't the same soft, warm glow she remembered. It was harsh, unnatural, like the flickering light of a dying bulb. And as she looked down, her heart clenched. Blood. Her own blood was smeared across the floor, forming dark puddles that looked almost black in the dim light. The trail of it led up to the living room, where she could hear faint sounds, whispers, murmuring just beyond her reach. Emma's hands trembled as she wiped her eyes, trying to clear the image, but it wouldn't go away. It was like she was locked inside this place, this distorted version of reality, and she couldn't get out. But as she stepped toward the source of the sound, something in her gut told her not to. "You have to understand, Emma." The voice was Jeremy's again, but it wasn't the voice of the boy she remembered. This voice was cold, cruel, the sound of something far more insidious. "You'll never escape until you see what you've been blind to." The floorboards creaked under her feet as she hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing against her like an unseen hand. "Jeremy?" Her voice wavered, her heart hammering in her chest. The shadows loomed ahead, thickening as she walked, seeming to swallow the light from the room as she entered. The living room was a distorted mirror of the one she had known. The walls were warped, twisted in places, the furniture overturned, the chairs bent in unnatural angles. And there, in the center of it all, was her brother. He stood still as a statue, his face expressionless, his eyes hollow. He was not the boy she had loved, the brother she'd grown up with. He was something darker, something far more malevolent. His skin had taken on an unnatural pallor, his mouth twisted into a grimace that wasn't quite a smile. "You always were blind to me, Emma." His voice was low, a growl that made the room feel like it was closing in on her. "But you were never meant to see it. Not until it was too late." "What are you talking about?" she gasped, her voice trembling. "I trusted you." The shadows around her seemed to twitch, their edges snapping like the sharpest claws, and Jeremy stepped forward, his movements unnaturally slow, deliberate. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the terror in his gaze seemed to flicker, like a brief spark of humanity fighting to break free. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by something darker, something that made Emma's blood run cold. "You didn't trust me, Emma. You trusted the idea of me." His voice was chilling, and as he took another step closer, the darkness around him seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. "You never saw me for what I was. You never saw the monster I'd become." Emma gasped, the words hitting her like a physical blow. "No," she whispered, the air around her thick with disbelief. "No, you're my brother. I knew you. I loved you." But Jeremy's lips curled into a smile that made her want to scream. It wasn't the smile of a sibling who had shared their childhood, their secrets. This was the smile of a stranger, a person she didn't recognize at all. "That's the problem, Emma." His voice was soft, almost pitying, and it made her stomach churn. "You loved a lie." But it wasn't just her brother who had poisoned her life. It was her too, her denial, her avoidance of the darkness she should have seen. She had chosen to ignore the warning signs. She had chosen to believe everything was fine. She had chosen him. The silence that followed his words was deafening, and Emma could feel the weight of the guilt and the truth pressing against her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, but the room was closing in, suffocating her with its twisted reflection of the life she had once known. "You never saw me, Emma." "Not really." Jeremy's voice had dropped to a whisper now, his words colder, sharper. "But you will see it all now. You will see everything, and there's no going back." The darkness pressed in even harder, the air thickening, the shadows curling around her like tendrils, wrapping around her legs, pulling her deeper into the void. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The suffocating feeling in her chest grew until she thought she might choke on it, until the reality around her started to fracture, breaking apart in jagged pieces that made no sense. "No. No, Jeremy, stop. Please. I didn't." But the words cut off as the shadows around her seemed to engulf her completely, dragging her into the void. And before she could process what was happening, she felt a jolt, a sudden sensation of falling, of everything crumbling beneath her. The fall felt endless. It was as though the world had opened up beneath her, and Emma was being pulled into the dark abyss of some vast, bottomless chasm. The air was so thick, so heavy, that she couldn't take a proper breath. Every inch of her body felt like it was being stretched apart, torn from its core, as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling around her. She couldn't scream, couldn't even open her mouth. It was as if the darkness had swallowed her whole, and now she was trapped in its depths, suspended in a limbo that had no beginning and no end. The oppressive silence filled her ears, louder than any scream, louder than any thought. It was deafening, suffocating, like the very air itself was choking her, pulling her into the very center of the void. And then, without warning, she stopped. The sensation of falling abruptly ceased, and she was left suspended in the dark space, disoriented, unable to move. Her mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened, but there was no clarity. There were no walls, no floor, no structure, just the sense of floating, of being trapped in a place that didn't belong anywhere. For a moment, Emma could only hear the thudding of her heart in her chest. It was the only sound left in this vast nothingness. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, to ground herself in something familiar. But when she opened them again, she found herself standing in a new space, still suspended between reality and the unknown, But this time, the space was different. This place felt too real. She was standing in the living room of her childhood home again. The walls were familiar, the furniture the same as it had been, but the air was suffocating. The light that poured through the windows was dim, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the room like claws, reaching for her, pulling at her very soul. The warmth of the home she remembered was gone, replaced by a bitter coldness that seeped into her bones, leaving her shivering despite the warmth of the room. Her father's voice was still in her head, echoing his last words, but now, there was a strange stillness to it. A hollow absence that felt wrong, like something was missing, something had shifted. And then, she heard the door creak open. Her heart stopped, the pulse in her throat hammering against her skin. She turned toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. The door had opened slowly, methodically, as though someone were taking their time. Someone who had been waiting for her. She didn't need to see who it was. She knew. Jeremy. His silhouette was dark against the doorway, his outline barely visible against the dim light. He stood there, just beyond the threshold, unmoving, staring at her with those hollow eyes. The same eyes that had haunted her in the moments before her death, eyes that held nothing but coldness, nothing but the absence of warmth. They were empty. Jeremy, her voice broke, a whisper that sounded weak even to her own ears. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, but her body refused to obey her commands. She couldn't move. She couldn't escape. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stepped into the room, the darkness following him like a shadow. The air grew heavier with each step he took, the walls pressing in on her as though they were alive. The coldness was unbearable, seeping into her skin, into her soul. "You don't belong here, Emma." Jeremy's voice was low, guttural, devoid of any emotion. It was a statement, not a question, and it sent a chill through her that froze her very bones. What are you talking about?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper, but the words tore at her throat. The fear was rising again, a wave of panic that made her head spin. Jeremy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took another step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. His face was pale, too pale, and his lips curled into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. It was a twisted thing, a grotesque imitation of something human, something he had once known, but now, it was nothing more than a mockery of the person he had been. "You've seen the truth now, haven't you, Emma?" Jeremy's voice was tinged with something darker, something that sounded almost like amusement. "You think this is some kind of mistake? You think I killed you because I was lost, or angry, or insane?" Emma took a step back, but her legs felt weak, unsteady. She could feel her breath quickening, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to hear this. She didn't want to understand. It was never a mistake. Jeremy continued, his voice now sharp, biting. "I did it because you never saw me for what I really am. You never saw me as the monster I've always been. And now you will understand what I've always known." The air around her thickened again, and Emma's head began to swim. She felt lightheaded, as though the room was spinning, as though the walls were closing in on her. Every word that Jeremy spoke was like a blow to her chest, each one knocking the breath out of her, until she could no longer catch her breath. "But you're dead." Emma's voice cracked, the words barely escaping her lips. "I'm dead. Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Jeremy smiled wider now, his teeth too sharp, too white in the dim light. It was wrong. Everything was wrong. He was wrong. "I don't want anything from you, Emma." His voice softened, but the malice in it only deepened. "I'm here to show you the truth." And with that, the shadows closed in around her again, thickening, swallowing her whole. The room disappeared, replaced by the suffocating void once more. And as the darkness consumed her, Emma realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that she had never really left. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the ground, the coldness of the unseen floor biting into her skin as she struggled to breathe. It was as though every inch of her being was weighted down by the invisible pressure of the space she had entered. The shadows coiled tighter around her, suffocating her, each breath harder to take as if the darkness itself was constricting her lungs, pushing her deeper into despair. The absence of sound was deafening. There was no heartbeat, no whispering air, just an oppressive quiet that bore down on her, relentless and cruel. But there was a shift. Emma felt it, deep in the marrow of her bones, a change in the atmosphere. A presence, ancient and powerful, creeping just beyond the edge of her awareness. She wasn't alone, and yet, she didn't feel the cold, malevolent pull of her brother's influence anymore. This was something else, something beyond the void she had come to know. The shadows receded, just slightly, revealing a small sliver of light in the distance. It flickered like a dying candle, faint and fragile, but still there. She was drawn to it instinctively, the flicker of hope pulling her forward, urging her to stand, to move. As she stumbled toward it, she felt a cold gust of air brush against her face, the scent of something far older than her. The faintest glimmer of warmth radiated from the light, filling her chest with a deep, aching need to understand what this place was, to understand where she was now. And then, from the depths of the shadows, a figure stepped forward, no longer a haunting specter of her brother, but a being of light. The figure was luminous, bathed in a soft glow that burned her eyes, but not in a painful way. It was an overwhelming sense of purity, of something she had never felt before, and yet somehow, deep inside her, she knew it. She recognized it. The figure's face was obscured by the light surrounding it, but the voice that came from it was clear, resonating deep within her, as though it were woven into the very fabric of her being. Emma. The voice was calm, but there was something unnervingly familiar about it. She didn't know who it belonged to, but it felt as though it had been waiting for her, as if it had been part of her from the very beginning. "Who are you?" Emma croaked, barely able to make out the words through the tightness in her chest. Her throat felt raw, her body still trembling from the experience. "Where am I?" The figure didn't move. It was still, silent for a moment, as if weighing her question carefully. The light around it seemed to pulse with each beat of her heart, casting shifting shadows across the room, yet it never wavered. "You are between, Emma." The voice softened, becoming more like a whisper. "Between the world you once knew and the one you were never meant to see." Her heart stopped. "Between? Between?" Emma repeated, her voice shaking as the realization slowly began to form. "But I died. I know I died." The figure nodded, its form shifting slightly, as if it were considering her words. "Yes, you did die." The voice held no judgment, no malice. It was simply a statement of fact. But death, Emma, is not as it seems. It is not a final end, but a transition, a passage to something far more complex. Emma's head swam as the weight of its words hit her like a tidal wave. This wasn't death as she had known it. She wasn't in some ethereal heaven or hell, the places that had been drilled into her mind her entire life. She was somewhere else. "What do you mean?" Her voice cracked under the strain of the question. "What is this place? What is this?" She gestured to the shadows that still lingered at the edges of the light. The figure took a step forward, its presence commanding but not threatening. There was a profound sadness in its voice as it spoke again, and for the first time, Emma felt something like compassion in the space around her. "This place is the truth you have been denied, Emma." The figure's tone grew softer, almost mournful. "It is the space where all things unfulfilled, all things unresolved, are left to be understood. It is the realm of consequence, of revelation." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Consequences? Revelations? The terror she had felt earlier began to recede, but in its place was something more powerful, more intense. The weight of her own guilt, her memories of Jeremy, her life, was slowly being replaced with an unbearable sense of understanding, one that was much worse than anything she had ever feared. "Jeremy," Emma's voice faltered, but the figure was already answering, its face softening, though still shrouded in light. "Jeremy was never meant to do this, Emma. But you were always meant to see the truth." The figure's voice carried a weight that shook Emma to her core. "He was only a catalyst for what was already inside of you, the darkness that you failed to confront." A coldness washed over her again. She could feel her chest tighten, her heart aching with the growing realization of everything that had led her to this moment. The darkness she failed to confront. The things she chose to ignore. The guilt. "What was inside of me?" she whispered, but she already knew the answer. The shadows around her seemed to pulse at the question, as if they were breathing, waiting for her to understand. "The poison inside you, Emma. The lies, the denial. You were blind to everything that was wrong, even when the signs were there." The figure's voice grew soft, almost sorrowful. "And now you must face it. You must face the truth of what was always there." Emma's breath hitched. "The truth? What is the truth?" Her voice cracked, the question falling from her lips like a prayer. But the figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it reached out, and when it touched her forehead, everything in her mind fractured. And in that moment, she saw it. The truth, as horrifying and devastating as it was. The figure's touch lingered on Emma's forehead, sending a shockwave of raw energy through her body. Her mind erupted in chaos. Memories flashed before her eyes, not just her own but fragments of something darker, something deeper. It wasn't just the pain of her death that she was seeing, it was everything. The house, the smiles, the laughter, the deception, the manipulation. Her brother, but not Jeremy as she had known him. Not the innocent child she once cared for. No, this was something more horrifying, more insidious. This was the truth. Emma's vision blurred. The space around her folded like paper, and she felt herself falling again, deeper, further into a reality she wasn't prepared for. She could hear whispers, distant and hollow, swirling in the void around her. Their voices grew louder, but they didn't make sense. She could feel the pull of something ancient, something dark, and it was reaching for her. Her chest tightened with dread, and her heartbeat hammered in her ears. The figure's voice cut through the fog, almost inaudible, yet sharp and full of meaning. "You never truly knew him, Emma." The words wrapped around her like a coil, squeezing her lungs, pushing her deeper into the darkness. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her. It felt as though the very air was being sucked out of the space she was in. Then, something twisted. The darkness around her contorted, the edges of reality bending in ways she had never seen before. Her father's voice, that soft echo from before, suddenly twisted into something darker, more sinister, as if it had been corrupted. "You think you understand?" His voice was jagged now, warped by a malevolent force she could barely comprehend. "You don't know the half of it." Her heart raced. The walls around her seemed to splinter and crack, the very structure of the reality she had known breaking apart at the seams. She couldn't hold on to anything. Everything was slipping away, sliding through her fingers. She spun around, her mind screaming, but there was no escape. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. Her father's form was fading in and out of her sight, shifting, blending into the shadows. His words became louder, more urgent, more frantic. "It wasn't just him, Emma." His voice cracked, filled with a sudden desperation. "It was me. I did this to you. I let it happen. I failed you." Her stomach twisted with the revelation. What was he talking about? Before she could process it, another figure appeared, a man, cloaked in shadows, stepping out of the darkness as though he had been there all along. He was tall, looming, with a face she didn't recognize, but there was something familiar about him, something terrifying. "You didn't just die at the hands of your brother. You died because of him and her." The man's voice boomed, echoing through the space like thunder, shaking her to the core. Emma took a step back, her breath ragged in her throat. Her vision blurred, her mind struggling to process what was unfolding before her. "Who are you?" she gasped, her hands shaking. "Who are you?" The man's grin spread wide across his face. His eyes gleamed with a malevolent fire as he stepped forward, his presence overwhelming. "I'm someone you should have never crossed, Emma. I am the one who holds the keys to everything. You were never supposed to see this, to understand. But now that you're here," his grin deepened. "There's no way out." Suddenly, everything clicked. The pieces of the puzzle she had been too blind to see for so long, the truth she had been refusing to face. This was bigger than Jeremy. This wasn't just about her brother's betrayal. It wasn't just about her death. It was about something far darker, something that had been lurking behind the facade of her life all along. The man in front of her wasn't just an agent of the darkness. He was the darkness. He was the force that had consumed her brother's mind, the malevolent power that had twisted their family, their relationships, into something grotesque. He had been pulling the strings from the shadows, and Emma had never known. But as the pieces fell into place, another voice spoke, this time so close, so sharp, that it felt like a dagger being driven into her heart. "You think this ends here, Emma?" It was Jeremy's voice, but this time it wasn't empty. It wasn't cold. There was something in it, something much more terrifying. He stepped forward from the shadows, his face twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. "You think I was the problem? No, no, no." He shook his head, and Emma's blood turned to ice. "You were never meant to see what I've seen. But now you will." Emma's knees gave way, and she fell to the ground. Her mind reeled as the room around her spun in circles, the walls bending, warping, as if everything were folding in on itself. This wasn't the afterlife. This wasn't some twisted heaven or hell. This was nothing. This was a place where all of her deepest, darkest fears and regrets had been twisted into something unrecognizable. "No!" Emma screamed, her voice raw, as she crawled backward. She didn't want to see this. She didn't want to know what was coming next. "You've seen the truth, Emma. Now you will feel it." The figure in front of her stepped forward, his hand reaching out as though to grasp her soul, to pull her into the very depths of the darkness she had tried so desperately to escape. Suddenly, there was a flash, a brilliant light that split the darkness in half. The figure staggered back, his face contorted in agony as the light burned through him like a cleansing fire. Emma blinked, her heart racing. The light wasn't just illuminating the shadows. It was fighting them. And she realized, with a sickening jolt of fear and clarity, that she had never been alone. She hadn't been abandoned. The truth wasn't just about her death, it was about redemption. And there was someone who had come to claim it. But who? Who was reaching into the void to save her from the darkness? And more importantly, could they? Could anyone save her now? Her breath caught in her throat as the figure before her recoiled from the light, its form flickering as though it were being burned away by the very thing it had tried to suppress. And then, the light intensified, becoming almost unbearable, and Emma shielded her eyes, though she knew she couldn't escape it. The figure that had haunted her, the dark presence that had manipulated her brother, that had orchestrated her death, let out a scream, a shrill, inhuman sound that echoed through the space. It was a cry of pain, of frustration, of a power that was slipping away. But then, just as suddenly as the light had appeared, it started to fade. It was as if the very source of it was being extinguished, pulled away, leaving only a dim glow in its wake. The figure's shadow began to shrink, the terror it had instilled in her fading as if it were never real to begin with. Emma stood there, heart pounding in her chest, the shock of what she was witnessing coursing through her veins. This was it, the moment of reckoning. "No, you can't escape." The figure's voice twisted, growing weaker, but there was no hiding the malice in it. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface, trying to assert its control. But the light was growing once more, flaring out with a force that sent a shockwave through the air. The figure screeched as if the very essence of its being was being torn apart. In the chaos, the figure's true form began to reveal itself, shifting, melting, a mass of broken memories and twisted shadows. It was like watching a nightmare unravel. Through the blinding glow, Emma could make out a new presence standing beside her, calm and resolute, like a beacon in the storm. She felt its warmth like a balm against the storm of terror and confusion in her mind. It was human, but not. It was familiar, but distant. It was everything she needed to face this moment, to face the truth. And then, the voice spoke again, but this time, it wasn't the figure's. It wasn't Jeremy's. It was soft and strong, with an authority that Emma had never heard before. "You are not lost, Emma." The voice was gentle, like a parent speaking to a child, but there was power in it. Power that quieted the storm of confusion in her chest. Emma looked up and gasped, her eyes wide with disbelief. Standing beside her was a figure that felt as though it had been there all along, even if she hadn't realized it. It was a woman, radiant, ageless, with a presence that filled the room with a profound sense of peace. Her features were soft, kind, and yet there was something unearthly about her. She looked at Emma with eyes that were warm and knowing, filled with a love Emma had never known. Her mere presence seemed to quiet the chaos around them. "I don't understand," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible as the final remnants of the darkness that had once filled the room continued to shrink away. "What happened? Why am I here? Why did Jeremy do this?" The woman's gaze softened as she placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. Her touch was cool but comforting, and for the first time since her death, Emma felt the overwhelming weight of grief and confusion begin to lift. It was as though everything, the pain, the betrayal, the guilt, was slowly fading as if they had never existed at all. "Jeremy was lost, Emma?" The woman's voice was filled with a deep, eternal sadness, but it was not pity. It was understanding. He was consumed by darkness, by fear, by hatred, and you were caught in the middle. But his actions were never about you. They were about his own struggle. Emma's chest tightened, the weight of the woman's words sinking in. For the first time, she felt a flicker of clarity, of understanding. It was not her fault. It was never her fault. The woman's gaze softened, and she stepped back, allowing Emma to stand on her own 2 feet. The light had faded slightly, but it still held a gentle glow, casting a protective barrier around her. "He will face his reckoning, just as you must face yours. But his path is not yours. You are free now, Emma." Her words were like a release, a weight being lifted from Emma's soul. She could feel the darkness, the terror, the confusion, everything she had carried for so long, begin to dissolve, leaving her with a sense of peace she had never known. "What happens now?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling with the enormity of it all. The woman smiled softly, her eyes full of compassion. "You go on, Emma. You have been given a choice. You can let go of the past and move forward, or you can stay here, in the darkness, bound by what was." Emma felt her heart thudding in her chest. The choice was hers. For the first time, she realized that she had control. She wasn't just a victim of her circumstances. She wasn't just a ghost lost in the void. With the woman's guidance, Emma could see it, the path forward. A new path. One where she could heal, where she could forgive, and perhaps even find peace. "I will go on." Emma spoke the words with a quiet certainty, and as soon as she did, the light enveloped her, wrapping around her like a soft embrace. The pain, the terror, and the weight of the past seemed to fade away, replaced by a growing warmth in her chest.